Thank you, Ms. Sanchez. Mr. Schellenberger, first, I'd just like to compliment you on your choice of tie today. Seems like we're on the same page. I would also just like to respond to your last point and just remind everyone that, of course, we all believe in the First Amendment, but the First Amendment applies to government prohibition of speech, not to private companies. I want to talk about your Twitter files number 7, Mr. Schellenberger. Are you aware that Rudy Giuliani was the sole source of the hard drive obtained by the New York Post?
That is my understanding.
And are you aware that Rudy Giuliani had been openly cavorting with agents of Russian intelligence throughout 2020?
That is also my understanding.
Now, this was the same Russian agent who had been feeding information to Senators Johnson and Grassley, I might add. But also, are you aware that Rudy Giuliani told the New York Times that he did not want anyone to do an analysis of the hard drive until it was published?
I was not aware of that exactly, but...
But you don't dispute it?
I don't dispute it.
And are you aware that one of the New York Post reporters for the Hunter Biden story refused to put his byline on the story?
Yes.
And are you aware that Fox News called the story, quote, very sketchy, unquote?
I'm aware that somebody at Fox News said that, yes.
Correct. Brett Baer at Fox News said
yes.
that. And are you aware that the FBI had nothing to do with Twitter's decision to pause the New York Post story?
I am not aware of that.
Okay, well, let me read you the testimony from Yoel Roth at the hearing we had on February 8th. Quote, the FBI was quite careful and consistent to request review of the accounts, but not to cross the line into advocating for Twitter to take any particular action. And then Jim Baker said, in response to the chairman's question, when he asked, did you talk to the FBI about the Hunter Biden story? He said, to the best of my recollection, I did not talk to the FBI about the Hunter Biden story before that day. In other testimony, Yoel Roth said that the information that he received from the FBI had nothing to do with the Hunter Biden story. Now, are you aware that there was an analysis of the hard drive that was done by the Washington Post at a later date?
My awareness is that multiple media organizations have done analyses and found including CBS, and found that it was indeed, the laptop was authentic and that nothing had been changed on it.
So let's just get something clear. The laptop that the FBI had is different than the hard drive that Rudy Giuliani gave to the New York Post. A hard drive, you agree with this, is a copy from a laptop, right?
Yes.
And you are aware that hard drives can be altered, are you not?
Of course.
Okay. So are you aware that the Washington Post analysis of the hard drive showed that it had been altered?
I have heard that, but I'm also saying CBS verified.
Politico.
And other media organizations have verified. I mean,
we're not talking about
authenticity.
We're not talking about authenticity. We're talking about whether it's been altered.
Yeah.
Okay? There's no question there's some material on the hard drive that is authentic and accurate, but are you aware that there's some material that is not?
My understanding is that there are copies of the hard drive that have been tampered with, and that media organizations, including CBS, have verified that the laptop in question was not tampered with.
I don't know what the laptop in question, but let's move on, because you said in your Twitter files, am I correct, that every single fact in the New York Post story was accurate?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall that the first paragraph of that Post story said that then Vice President Joe Biden pressured Ukraine to fire its prosecutor general because he was investigating Burisma, where Hunter Biden was on the board?
Yes.
Okay. I have here, which I'd like to enter into the record, the Trump-Ukraine Impeachment Inquiry Report, 300 pages by the House Intelligence Committee. Did you review this report before you said that every fact in this story was accurate?
Without objection, the material be entered in the record.
Did I read that before I wrote the Twitter files? No.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm aware
because
of its
if
content.
you read this, you would have known that every single State Department and Trump administration expert on Ukraine said that Vice President Joe Biden, in concert with the European Union and the IMF, was executing official U.S. policy by encouraging Ukraine to fire the prosecutor general because he was not prosecuting corruption and was not prosecuting companies like Burisma. So that story, notwithstanding your allegations, was false. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz, for 5 minutes.
Impeachment nostalgia always warms my heart, but we are here focused on a weaponized government, a whole-of-government approach that has been turned against the American people. And while Rudy Giuliani may have been running around with the laptop in 2020, what is an indisputable fact is that the FBI had the laptop in 2019. And it appears that the last round of questioning misses the boat, that it's true. The information is authentic. The pictures, the videos, the emails, there hasn't been a single allegation that there is a single doctored email. Unlike what we saw before the FISA courts, where the FBI itself was doctoring emails to try to smear President Trump. But I have to get to a question I'm amazed hasn't been asked of the two of you. This FTC consent decree, where it is government action subject to rigorous scrutiny under First Amendment standards, government action demanding that your names be listed. How did it feel when you found out that you were being expressly targeted by a government document based on your reporting?
It was chilling. I mean, it's disturbing. I never thought that would happen in the United States of America, to be perfectly honest. I've lived in a bunch of authoritarian countries. I've visited a lot of authoritarian countries. Never thought this kind of thing would be going on here.
And the nexus to authoritarianism is the desire to control the nature of truth itself. Our understandings change about things. We learn new things. We challenge prior assumptions. But if a bunch of people in Washington, D.C. get to decide what the truth is, and then enforce it on the country, and then punish and target those who report on their conduct, we are drifting more toward that. How did you feel, Mr. Taibbi, when you saw your name?
I was upset, obviously. I lived in Russia during the 90s and early 2000s. I was there when Putin took power. I was friends with a group of very brave, muckraking reporters in Russia, many of whom didn't make it. A few of them were murdered after Putin came to power. So I've always been conscious of how the risks that other reporters take in other countries are incredibly severe, and that's one of the reasons why I'm motivated to protect the First Amendment, because our country has the best protections for reporters in the world. But this kind of thing, where the government is looking for information about reporters, it's usually a canary in the coal mine that something worse is coming in terms of an effort to exercise control over the press. And so on that level, it's absolutely disturbing. Also, the Aspen Institute report that we published today, talked about today in the Twitter Files thread, one of their recommendations was that the FTC be empowered to have unlimited power to search all data of private companies so that they could more freely and more accurately search the speech of ordinary citizens.
So as we're trying to put downward pressure on the government's expanding authority to be able to engage in what we see mostly from dictatorships, what you're reporting and what you're observing is that actually they view this as a growth industry, the information business, right? This yes. Censorship industrial complex is a growth industry to the government.
I think the key thing also, yes, and the thing to understand is that NSF...
What is NewsGuard, and how are they part of the censorship industrial complex?
Yeah, and by the way, we talked about Richard Stengel. He's on the board of NewsGuard. NewsGuard and the Disinformation Index are both U.S. government-funded entities who are working to drive advertiser revenue away from disfavored publications and towards the ones that they favor. This is...
Now, what I'm used to in this town is government officials pick their favorite outlets and they give them the best scoops and they give them the best stories. And there's a fusion of media and government that has long made me uncomfortable. But what you're describing now is literally the directing of revenue to certain media companies over other media companies designed and implemented with U.S. government funding and support.
That's right.
That is an astonishing, if we do not take a look at NewsGuard, we have failed. And you talk about the brave reporting that occurs and what it subjects you to. I would suggest there's also political bravery that I have observed. While we've only heard from Democrats on this panel attacking you, discrediting you, a lot like they've tried to attack and discredit FBI whistleblowers who are truth tellers, there are brave Democrats who still believe in free speech, and I would advise my colleagues to look at the comments of Ro Khanna, who has been deeply, deeply concerned about this weaponization of government, and he believes these Twitter files are indeed worthy of our focus and our energy, and that is exactly what we are going to do. I yield back.
I think the gentleman would now recognize the gentlelady from New York.
I still have my 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, that's right, I forgot.
I understand why you may not.
Because you were yielded 5. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank
Excuse
you.
me.
Mr. Schellenberger, I may have misheard earlier, but is it your testimony here today that you disagree with the 2 indictments by Special Counsel Robert Mueller that definitively established that Russia interfered in our 2016 election through social media disinformation and a hack and leak operation?
No, I don't disagree.
Okay, Mr. Taibbi, do you disagree with those 2 indictments?
Well, indictments aren't a thing to
Do you disagree,
with.
there are about 40 or 50 pages. Do you disagree with the evidence outlined in those indictments?
Well, indictments are just charges.
I just asked you, do you disagree with the evidence included in those indictments? Yes or no?
I'm not on the jury of that case. I couldn't possibly say yes or no.
Okay, because you said earlier, I believe, that you did not see Russia, you could not confirm that Russia interfered in our election in 2016, that you don't believe that. Is that your testimony here today? You don't believe that they did?
I think it's possible that they may have on a small scale, but certainly not to what's been reported.
What's been reported or what's been included in the indictments?
Well, again, indictments are allegations. They're not proof. And
I understand. It's pretty detailed allegations.
In the Mueller indictment, by the way.
You should go read the indictment and then come back and tell us if you actually think there's no proof of it.
Well,
but let me move on. Let me move on, please.
By the way, when
please,
they showed
let me
up
move on. That's how this works. You should know that by now. So, do you disagree with the Special Counsel Mueller's conclusion in his report, Mr. Taibbi, that the Trump campaign knew about Russia's interference, they welcomed it, and they used it for their benefit? You have no reason to disagree with that, don't you? You have no information. So after that foreign interference in our 2016 election, Twitter and other social media companies naturally wanted to work with the intelligence community to stop Vladimir Putin from interfering in our elections again. Mr. Taibbi, do you think it's a legitimate pursuit of the FBI to try to stop foreign interference in our elections?
Again, sir, will I be allowed to answer this question, or
It's a yes or no question. Do you think it's a legitimate pursuit of the FBI?
it's not a yes or no answer?
No. I'm not asking how. I'm saying, as an objective, do you think it's a legitimate objective of the FBI to stop foreign interference in our elections?
I think it's a legitimate objective to stop actual foreign interference.
Okay. I mean, I don't know what the difference is, but that's fine.
Well,
Since Russia used social media disinformation, according to Special Counsel Mueller, I understand you may disagree with the allegations, to interfere in our 2016 elections, are you trying to say that the FBI had no basis to inform social media companies about efforts to potentially interfere in our elections after 2016?
I can tell you that I read internal Twitter emails where Twitter expressly talked about the fact that the FBI couldn't possibly know more than they did about whether or not there was Russian interference, and that in fact, even they couldn't determine which accounts were actually IRA and which ones weren't.
Okay, I understand you like to filibuster. That was not an answer to my question, but I'll move on. Mr. Schellenberger, in all of the emails that you reviewed, did the FBI ever direct Twitter to take down any accounts or remove any posts?
Yes.
They directed Twitter to remove them, or they said these may violate your terms and services?
Yes. I think that's an accurate use of the word direct.
They said these may violate. You think that saying that
Yes,
these
I
may
do.
violate your terms and conditions is the same as directing them to take an account down?
Yeah, I mean, I think if a police officer says,
All right, well,
you
that's,
broke
that's
the
very
law.
helpful. That's very helpful. I'm glad to know that you think flagging something for a private company to make a decision about what they should do is a direction. Now, Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
you have repeatedly said that this committee is all about protecting the First Amendment. And what's unfortunate here is that we are talking about Twitter, and that we are not talking about Republican government officials around the country who are banning books. And we are not talking about—
Would the gentleman yield?
No, I will not. And we are not talking about Donald Trump jailing his former counsel to prohibit him from publishing a book that the president did not want. The former president literally jailed his enemy. And we're here talking about Twitter. Twitter. And even with Twitter, you cannot find actual evidence of any direct government censorship of any lawful speech. And when I say lawful, I mean non-criminal speech, because plenty of speech is non-criminal.
I'll give you one. The gentleman's time to expire. I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following email from Clark Humphrey, Executive Office of the Presidency, White House Office, January 23rd, 2021. That's the Biden administration, 4:39 a.m. Hey, folks. This goes to Twitter. Hey, folks, wanted to use the term they used the term Mr. Goldman just used. Wanted to flag the below tweet, and I'm wondering if we can get moving on the process for having it removed ASAP.
Boom.
That is.
Could you read the below tweet?
And then if we can keep an eye out for tweets that fall in this same genre, that would be great. This is a tweet on the very issue that Thomas
Can you
Mr.
just,
Massey brought.
for the fullness of the record, can you read the, because I've not seen this, can you read the tweet that it's referencing?
I don't have the tweet here with me, but the gentleman's
shocking.
point was, tell us, you said no time did government try to tell Twitter to take that, to explicitly remove something, and
No, I said
it says-
explicitly remove lawful speech. Lawful speech. We're going to conflate. The First Amendment is not absolute.
Twitter, this is something from Robert Kennedy Jr.
But for
So
the
I
record,
assume that's lawful
as a point
speech?
of order, Mr. Chair.
Because
if you-
Robert Kennedy
just
Jr.
a
said
minute,
it? That's
just
why
a
it's
minute.
lawful speech?
Just a minute,
get the
Mr.
tweet for you.
Goldman.
But all I'm saying
Mr.
is you
Chair,
said in no time did the government explicitly say to take a tweet down. Here we have it, right here,
Mr.
from the White
Chair?
House. They couldn't even wait 2 days. 2 days into this administration, they were asked Twitter to
Mr.
take something
Chair.
down, and we will get you the underlying tweet.
Thank
With that,
you.
I recognize the gentlelady from New York.
will you place it into the record as well, sir? The underlying tweet?
Databases, I just want to say the military or the Army is part of, the Constitution. So keeping a list of who are our soldiers or not, I'm not objecting to that database. It's good to know who's in the Army or not. So I just wanted to point that out. The other thing is the argument that this is— Yield back.
reclaiming my time on that point, we also happen to think it is good to know whether someone who is attempting to take a job illegally is entitled to that job.
Right.
And that is what the E-Verify system is all about. It consults existing databases just as any case of stolen valor would consult an existing database, this one of our veterans.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
To the point of it consults existing databases, that's the way the NICS system works as well. It consults existing databases. And many of these background checks consult existing databases. The fact that you're referencing the database doesn't mean that the database doesn't exist. And I yield back.
And again, what you're doing is you're creating a market for fraudulent documents, just different fraudulent documents that are presented right now. I yield to my
Isn't
friend,
that, isn't that what E-Verify does?
Thank you. My friend, Mr.
Thank you.
Gaetz.
And
No, E-Verify-
I'm intrigued because I share your skepticism of NICS, but I'm thinking to myself, this is a gentleman who probably has never witnessed how the E-Verify system works when somebody comes in and is applying for a job, like I have seen. Something in the magnitude of nearly 100% get immediate responses, whether they have presented a valid identification or not. This is different than NICS. The NICS system is asking for something entirely different. We are asking something very uniquely American. That's what we're doing. And the reality is, I'm looking at the gentleman who I have esteem and respect for and say, you ain't never seen it happen. I have. And it works. And it works in Arizona. And so you're about to, and the gentleman from California is right, you're about to create a new black market for fake identification.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will.
Would the gentleman yield?
I don't control the time. I'm yielding back to Mr. McClintock.
I'll yield my final seconds.
Well, thank you. The gentleman says it works in Arizona. It may very well work in Arizona, but all the American farm organizations say it doesn't work in our farming areas, which are predominantly north of Arizona.
Which is what is undermining the law itself.
Gentleman's time.
The gentleman keeps telling us no one is above.
Gentleman's time's expired. Mr. Correa, seek recognition? You recognize 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to comment on the issue of uniquely American. Most of you may have heard me talk about Jose Angel Garibay, the dreamer that was the first casualty of war, made the ultimate sacrifice in the Iraq War, first Iraq War. Dreamer, 21 years old, mother undocumented. He laid down his life as his country. Posthumously, we made him an American citizen. I've met with a lot of veterans, green card holders, deported veterans. One of them served 10 tours of duty in Afghanistan, came back challenged psychologically. I wonder if it's American to question them whether they have the right to a job in the United States. That's what we're talking about here, folks. Veterans. Veterans who have fought, like most of us have not, for this country, and come back and simply want to work.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
When I meet with my veterans groups and my veterans back in the district, it's always one of the top 3 issues is employment for veterans later. And we should not seek to make it harder for them to get a job, ever. I mean, we owe it to them. And here in Congress, we implement so many exceptions or exemptions, or we try to create an environment where veterans can more easily get a job when they return from service to our country, to service in our country. And so I agree with the gentleman. They don't need another impediment to getting a job, no matter how minutely small it might be. And I yield back.
I agree with my colleague from Kentucky. If you talk to veterans, they're very quiet, shy, reserved individuals who it takes a lot to get them to talk about their experience in the field of war. It takes a whole lot more to get them to apply for a job or to ask for anything at all to help them to get a job. And for us to put another impediment in front of a veteran to get a job, that is un-American. Chair, I yield.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Who's recognized? Who seeks recognition? Mr. Gaetz?
Well, I would observe that perhaps in some cases, the impediment to a veteran getting a job is an illegal alien illegally competing against that veteran for a job. And that probably happens with far greater frequency than E-Verify functioning as the barrier between a veteran and employment. I believe I still represent the highest concentration of veterans and active duty service members in the entire United States Congress. And certainly while veteran employment is an issue at the top of their list, when I talk to many of them, they reflect on the fact that they serve a nation that is not serious about protecting its border, that is not serious about internally enforcing its immigration laws, and the patriotism that I see reflected in veterans would certainly be would be in line with this in a moment, because I have to address for a moment the distinguished ranking member's characterization that while something might work in Arizona, it might not work in an agricultural community. And so perhaps the gentleman from Manhattan would note that if you eat any leafy green vegetable in the wintertime in the lower 48 of the United States, there is like a greater than 50% chance that it was grown in Yuma, Arizona, maybe closer to 80%. So while they're munching down on their butter lettuce and kale and other terrific leafy green vegetables in Greenwich Village, they can thank some Arizona farmers who are effectively using E-Verify today to ensure that that salad is delicious and well enjoyed. And I would yield to my colleague from Arizona to further opine as to the agricultural prowess of his beloved state.
Yeah, I would say I thought it was remarkable. It indicates that you weren't listening to any of the comments that I've made on E-Verify earlier. 90% of all leafy green that comes to you in the winter comes from Yuma, Arizona. And many on this committee have come with me, and we've wandered the fields and talked to the growers, the major growers who work not just in Yuma County, but in Imperial County to the west of us in California, as they produce tremendous agricultural products. Some of the biggest dairy farms are in Pinal County, Arizona. One of the top 15 egg producers in this country is in Maricopa County, Arizona. Somehow they all manage to use the E-Verify system, and it works for them. Which gets to the point. In Maricopa County and Pima County, you have two of the larger veteran populations in the country. I meet with veterans when I'm in the district almost weekly. I never have anyone say, gee, Andy, you know, since for the last 16 years we've had the E-Verify system in Arizona and I'm having trouble. That's an impediment to me as a veteran to get a job. Never has that been raised. Never has that been raised. But they have raised, I'm competing with low-wage illegal aliens who have come in. They have mentioned that. Well, I yield back to my friend from
Mr. Biggs,
Florida, and I thank you.
I yield to Mr. Buck.
I would just appreciate if my friend from Arizona would acknowledge that the water that's used for those Arizona leafy products comes from Colorado. All this Arizona stuff is making me a little ill. Let's acknowledge where the water comes from.
I'll reclaim my time and yield to Mr. McClintock.
I just wanted to observe how ironic it is to use veterans who have sacrificed so much through the centuries to defend our borders abroad as an excuse to undermine those borders here at home. And I yield back to the gentleman.
Yield to Ms. Johnson.
Thank you. I just want to note, I'm sure Mr. Biggs would agree.
Committee will be in order. The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Our criminal justice system is insane. It's dangerous, it's harmful, and it is destroying the fabric of our city. Time and again, our police officers make an arrest, and then the person who is arrested for assault, felonious assault, robberies, and gun possession, they're finding themselves back on the street within days, if not hours, after arrest. Eric Adams, New York mayor. My friends, the reason we are here in New York is because you have Democrats, you have citizens calling for some relief from this pain, and we are here not to use anyone, but to uplift the voices of brave people who are here to tell their story. Ms. Brame, do you feel used in this hearing?
Gentleman's recognized.
Ms. Brame, do you feel used?
Not.
Ms. Harrison?
I'm a willing participant.
Ms. Harrison, do you feel used? Tell you what, let me ask you it this way. Do you feel more used by this committee hearing, or do you feel more used by a criminal justice system that allowed people to kill people that you love and care about with no consequence?
The latter, and I'm beyond grateful for the opportunity to testify here on behalf of victims, because the Democrat Party, including Mr. Nadler and everybody here today, has ignored us in this city. And we need federal oversight. We need help. We're not getting any kind of help. And the services that she wants to keep funding are not being provided to the victims. I have a woman sitting outside who is a victim of domestic violence, who was conned by an immigrant, and she is receiving no services whatsoever. So until we get a thorough audit to the outcomes of the services being provided, no, we need to find out what's going wrong and get the services to where they need to be.
I am not here to criticize any New Yorkers, except maybe one, and that's because so many New Yorkers will soon become Florida voters. This is an iconic city. It's actually our nation's most iconic city. And it's not because of the beautiful architecture, and it's not because of the geography. It is because the sense of hustle that is so inherent to the people who come to New York to achieve their dreams. And increasingly, that hustle is being replaced with fear. Councilman Holden, you and I are from different parties. If we talked about 1,000 things, we'd probably disagree about a vast majority of them. But here's my simple question for you. Is fear a rising feature of life in New York, or is fear a declining feature of life in New York?
It is increasingly worrisome what we're going through in New York City. Fear is an everyday event in New York City. Taking the subway. My wife is Asian American. She will not get on the New York City subway. My daughter will not get on a New York City subway for fear because many Asian Americans have been attacked.
But Mr. Kessler says there's just a lot of people here in Manhattan. You just have to take it. You just have to understand that this is going to be a violent place.
Which I found that insulting.
Well, Mr. DiGiacomo, you're here as the voice of law enforcement in many ways. And since the days of Cain and Abel, there has constantly been a violent criminal element as some feature of American society. And the lives we all get to live are lashed to whether or not we put that violent criminal element in charge or whether or not we constrain it for the sake of people who want freedom. And so my question for you is, when the day one memo of Alvin Bragg changes the way resisting arrest is treated, so people can resist arrest against law enforcement and not actually face a consequence for that, what does that do to the enterprise of policing?
Well, it makes the officers and the detectives on the street, their job, that much harder. Everything becomes confrontational or physical, and they put themselves, the police officers and detectives, are in harm's way.
Well,
now,
we don't want to do that, but I have only a moment left, and I have to address this matter of crime rates that my colleagues keep talking about. And to the extent that there is an impact on crime rates in major cities, I would suggest that that is exactly what you get with the Sorosization of the United States justice system. And in places like New Orleans, Louisiana, in places like Tampa, Florida, in Jacksonville, Florida, in Tucson, Arizona, increasingly George Soros is putting in upwards of $40 million to elect 75 DAs to be able to engage in these downgrades. And by the way, not only are they downgrading the violent things, they can't even win the cases they try. Mr. Holden, you pointed out the fact that Alvin Bragg is actually terrible at losing in court. And since I don't have time, I would ask you for the record, since he keeps losing all of his cases, we might opine as to why, and we might seek a better utilization of the federal resources that we provide. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee. Not agreed upon. Seeks recognition. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 7.
Clerk will report.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. McClintock, offered by Ms. Lofgren of California.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman from California reserves point of order. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
This amendment is simple. We should exempt people fleeing from communism and totalitarian dictatorships from this legislation, and we should allow them to apply for asylum as our laws intend. Now, there's been some confusion about this bill. However, I think it's important to be clear that as it stands right now, the bill would shut down asylum to the United States. Let me explain how that would work. This bill would require the DHS secretary to detain all asylum seekers or place them all in a Remain in Mexico type program. If the secretary fails to do this, DHS must suspend the entry of all migrants. Now, no Congress, under either Republican or Democratic leadership, has ever appropriated resources that would allow the detention of all migrants or has ever directed DHS to place every migrant in a Remain in Mexico program. Even former President Trump never tried to detain all migrants for the duration of their proceedings. His fiscal year 2021 appropriations request was for 60,000 detention beds. And in 2020, at the height of the pandemic and border closures, U.S. Customs and Border Protection still processed 440,000 migrants in immigration proceedings. Further, as the Trump and Biden administration have noted, and as was confirmed by the Supreme Court, Mexico must agree to any Remain in Mexico-style program. It can't be implemented unilaterally. Mexico opposes restarting the program. Because of this, the passage of this bill will result in the asylum system being shut down completely. Now, at one time, although there were disagreements between Republicans and Democrats, there was never a disagreement that we should provide safe haven to those who are fleeing from communism. When Saigon fell and Vietnamese fled from that communist regime, both Republicans and Democrats welcomed them. We put into law protection for Nicaraguans who were fleeing from communism, and the Cubans who fled from communism under Castro. They were welcomed by both Democrats and Republicans. We welcomed Russians who were fleeing from communism as reflected in the Lautenberg Amendment. Venezuelans who are fleeing from that communist regime have been protected under the Biden administration's protective orders. This would turn our back on those who are fleeing from communism. That's not the America I grew up in. Now, there are plenty of things that I disagree with in this bill. I consider it extreme in many regards. But I'm hopeful that at least we can find this common ground, as we always have historically. Let us provide safe haven for those who are fleeing from communism and who want to come here and join us as Americans standing up for freedom. Those who are fleeing communist China, Russians, Nicaraguans, Cubans, Venezuelans, we should welcome them who are fleeing from communism and understand that people who flee from communism and who come to America do so because they value freedom, just as we do.
Will the gentleman yield?
Not until I'm finished. Although it's been represented that this bill does not, in fact, preclude application for asylum, as I have mentioned, because of its drafting, in fact, it will prevent these individuals who are fleeing from communism to have the capacity to apply for asylum, as we have always allowed. Now, there was a time when colleagues on both sides of the aisle claimed to oppose communism, claimed to oppose totalitarian dictatorships. We welcome people fleeing from these totalitarian communist regimes. I hope that we can come together once again to oppose communism and to stand up for freedom and to allow those fleeing these totalitarian communist regimes to file for political asylum in our country. And with that, I see my time has expired.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, first, I would withdraw my point of order.
Gentleman withdraws his point of order is recognized now.
First, this does not shut down asylum claims. In fact, it enhances our ability to process asylum claims by removing the incentives that millions of people have taken to file fraudulent claims, clog the system, and make legitimate claimants wait years and years to resolve their situation. I would remind the gentlelady that the law already requires that every person illegally entering the country and claiming asylum has to be detained. That is the law. As Justice Alito pointed out, shall be detained means shall be detained. The fact that this administration is thumbing its nose at that law, ignoring that law, refusing to see that that law be faithfully executed, doesn't change the law. What this measure does is to reinforce that law, but offer alternatives. including providing for other venues to wait in Mexico. The gentlelady is wrong that awaiting in Mexico requires Mexico's consent. Mexico admitted these people into their country, and it is to their country that they're being turned back. That was the decision that Mexico made when it admitted them. And by the way, the purpose of asylum is to separate yourself from a government that is deliberately persecuting you because of your race, ethnicity, or your religious or political beliefs. Once they have arrived in Mexico, they have a right to apply for asylum in Mexico because they have now crossed the border that separates themselves from the government that is persecuting them. They do not have a right to pass through various countries and to claim asylum in the United States. But this bill still allows them to do so. They just are either to be detained, be turned back to Mexico, which had accepted them in the first place, or also allows for safe third country agreements as well. MPP and safe third country agreements were in place under the Trump administration. They had successfully reduced the number of fraudulent claims to de minimis amounts. They were allowing us then to actually process the legitimate claims that now have to wait years for processing. And unfortunately, on his very first day in office, Mr. Biden terminated MPP and shortly thereafter the safe third country agreements that had been negotiated. Again, I want to emphasize this preserves the right of every person to file a claim of asylum. It simply requires, as the law does, that they be detained or they can be turned back and await a decision in Mexico or in any safe third country that the administration has negotiated with. So with that, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I yield to the gentleman from Florida.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding. In addition to the concerns that the gentleman from California has shared, there seems to be a great deal of vagueness in the amendment. It requires, I guess, the department to assess what governments constitute communist or totalitarian dictatorships. And I'm left wondering, like, would someone coming here from Saudi Arabia be considered someone fleeing a totalitarian dictatorship?
Would the gentleman yield?
It's not my time,
Oh.
but if it's okay with Mr. McClintock.
I would just note that the Immigration Nationality Act itself has these provisions within it. It's nothing new.
Right, I guess, so long as Mr. McClintock would allow it to continue yielding me the time, my concern is that that's a dynamic feature of governance in a lot of places, right? Like, we've seen military coups in Guinea, Burkina Faso, Guyana. So in those places where there's a coup, is it considered a totalitarian dictatorship? I don't know, is communist in the eye of the ball? Would someone fleeing from Canada
Of course
be
not.
afforded the provision?
Of course not. And
I don't know.
If the gentleman would further yield.
It's Mr. McClintock.
I need to actually reclaim my time to make one final point, and that is that we have watched this administration exploit any loophole they can possibly find in the laws to invalidate those laws. What the gentlelady's amendment does, in addition to other things, is to give them a huge loophole with which to undo the border security of our country. Again, every legitimate asylum claim can be filed, and under this bill will be expedited because it removes the incentives to make illegitimate, fraudulent asylum claims by ceasing to reward those who make them with admission, indefinite residency, indefinite work authorization, and all sorts of free goods and services.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McClintock's objections make no sense. They assume that there is a third-party country. Let's take communist dictatorships like Vietnam or China, or totalitarian regimes like Russia. There is no third-party country. They come directly here. From Russia, they could just go to Alaska.
Sure, they can see it from up there.
Exactly. They can see it from there. So the point is there is no third party. There is no necessary third country from many totalitarian and communist regimes.
Will the gentleman
Now,
yield?
if you're talking about regimes in Latin America, yes, there may be third countries. But
Will
if
the
you're
gentleman
talking about
yield?
most totalitarian and communist regimes, there are no third countries. So the objection to this amendment makes no sense. And yes, I'll yield.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield to the gentlelady.
Yeah, I just want to briefly comment on the objections made. The Immigration and Nationality Act has various provisions relative to communism. Right now, if you're a communist, you're not admissible to the United States. The Department of Homeland Security and the Immigration Service makes a determination, an individual determination, that you might be inadmissible for that purpose. This is nothing new. Right now, they make a determination about if you're fleeing from communism. That is nothing new. They would not, under any circumstances, describe democratic countries as a communist regime. That's never happened, and it's not going to happen. This is really completely rooted in the current Immigration and Nationality Act. And I would just note, I understand the ranking member's point, but there are occasions when people present themselves at our border because they were unable to get travel documents into the United States, and they have a claim for political asylum that has always been righteous in the United States. They're fleeing from communism, and really because we have never, no one has ever, not Mr. Trump, not Mr. Biden, requested enough money to incarcerate every single person who appears at the border. It has never happened, and it couldn't happen, which means that the provisions in this bill that shut down the asylum provisions go into effect. And so all of these people who are fleeing from communism will not be permitted to present and to have their claim for asylum. And frankly, I find it of great concern that we would turn our back on our history of providing safe haven to victims of communism by saying, well, they went through a third country and therefore we're not going to provide haven. We've never done that. We didn't do it when the Vietnamese fled the communist regime. We didn't do it when the Cubans fled Castro. We didn't do it when the Nicaraguans fled communism, and I don't think we should start doing that now. And I thank the gentleman for yielding to me and yield back.
And I clearly agree.
Committee will be in order.
And I clearly agree with the gentlelady, although I point out that the question doesn't even arise because many times there is no third country. But whether there is or not, she is correct. We ought to be admitting refugees from communism and totalitarianism, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To hear the ranking member impugn the argument of
in Manhattan earlier this week. And what I heard from victims from crime is that they observe the soft on crime policies pushed by Democrats as far more dangerous than law-abiding gun owners who work to keep our communities safe. One of our witnesses even talked about being a good guy with a gun, being somebody able to provide for self-defense and the righteous defense of others. And I heard in that hearing a term I had never heard before from the Democrat witness, a crime gun. So I guess there are guns and crime guns. And I was left wondering what makes a gun a crime gun, and I think it's that it's in the hands of a criminal committing a crime. The very criminals that Democrats seem quite willing to turn out on our streets time and time again. We heard the Democrat witness at a joint hearing between the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committee invited by Democrats say that these braces make guns more powerful and more lethal, and it was the laugh line of the hearing and summarily rejected by experts. But what this rule proves is that the Biden administration and Democrats are intent to weaponize the ATF in order to erode the Second Amendment and take away constitutional rights from otherwise law-abiding Americans, and they intend to do so without the approval of Congress.
Gentleman yield.
And what undermines the passion from my Democrat colleagues is that when they had the ability to do this in law, when they had unified control of the government, they didn't do it. And so when they really come for your rights, and when they really want to erode the Constitution, they don't do it with folks who can be sent home by the voters. They do it with unelected bureaucrats with green eye shades somewhere in some windowless cubicle in the bowels of the ATF.
Will the gentleman yield?
The ATF has abused its rulemaking authority in attempting to regulate stabilizing braces, and these braces were invented by Alex Brosco, a U.S. Marine Corps and Army veteran, to help disabled combat veterans better control and safely fire guns at shooting ranges. I represent many of these disabled veterans in my district, and I can tell you the extent to which the opportunity to engage in competitive shooting is a mental health enhancer. It's what keeps people engaged. I worry about the number of veteran suicides we may see increase at an already totally unacceptable level if we were to take this away and take this mental health tool away. The ATF's decision also contradicted its own prior 2012 determination made during the Obama administration, not known as particularly kind to gun owners. And that was a decision that was relied upon by gun owners for a decade, that they would not be subject to the National Firearms Control Act with the purchase of this stabilizing brace. Now the ATF's rule will require the owners of roughly 40 million stabilizing braces in circulation to obtain some special registration, surrender or destroy their brace by the compliant state, or face severe criminal penalties. And what I can tell you is these will be enforced. I am increasingly aware of circumstances in my district where almost anyone involved in the firearms industry, they are seeing the ATF show up with crazy demands and enforcement that goes beyond what we would normally consider from a government agency simply trying to seek compliance. My friends, this is part of a comprehensive attack on the Second Amendment, and this legislation would vindicate at least those who require this stabilizing brace. And while we all share the desire to reduce the frequency of gun violence, there is no evidence to suggest that these stabilizing braces contribute to it. And it is rather rich that we're now hearing from our Democrat colleagues about the stabilizing braces, because when there was legislation that they proposed that they couldn't get passed in the Senate, they told us that stabilizing braces could convert weapons into bump stocks. And what a revealing moment that was. I yield my final moments to my colleague from Kentucky.
Well, the gentleman from Florida is correct. These are not shoulder stocks, as the other side says. There's two ways we know they're not shoulder stocks. One, the legal definition of a shoulder stock says designed and intended to be fired from the shoulder. These were not designed or intended to be fired from the shoulder. They were intended to be fired from the wrist. The other way we know they're not shoulder stocks is for a decade the ATF said they were not. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just 2 weeks ago, Nashville was the 13th school shooting to result in injury or death in 2023, and the 89th gun incident to take place on school grounds this year. This happens so often that I fear too many Americans are becoming numb to it. So numb that my colleagues sit here doing everything in their power to protect their unlimited access to guns, while we do nothing to protect our children from being slaughtered in their classrooms. Guns are the leading cause of death for children in America. That's a disgrace, and we're not powerless to do anything about it. And we sit here today, we're taking aim at the ATF, an agency created in part to protect Americans from gun violence. My colleagues are so obsessed with dismantling all gun restrictions in this country that they're fighting to allow gun manufacturers to continue exploiting a loophole in stabilizing brace regulations that makes weapons more dangerous. Claims that braces that allow a pistol to be fired from the shoulder aren't dangerous or don't change the gun are disingenuous at best and outright lies at worst. Let me put it plainly. Allowing a pistol to be fired from the shoulder creates a short-barreled rifle. And these highly powerful weapons have been recognized as extremely dangerous and have been heavily regulated in this country since 1934. And the industry knows this. Just watch this video for yourself. Mr. Chairman, I ask the clock stop. Okay, it's on. Never mind.
You see a gun like this and you're like, How the heck is a barrel with that length a pistol? Well, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about SB Tactical and their stabilizing braces. Forbes
sold and used to make pistols and just short barrel rifles, and everyone knows it. You just saw for yourself how this works. This is not about providing tools to disabled people who want to shoot firearms, many of whom are veterans. And my colleague said there's 10 to 15 million people who they described as weak who need these to shoot. We know that's not what's going on here. These braces are not that. They're manipulation by the gun lobby and gun sellers to skirt regulations on short barrel rifles and increase their sales because they make these firearms more lethal, more accurate, and easier to conceal. Shootings in major shootings have exploited this loophole in Dayton, Boulder, Colorado Springs, and most recently in Nashville. Who knows how many more murderers will do the same if we don't use our common sense and end this loophole, which is exactly what the ATF is doing with this rule. Joint Resolution 44 puts all Americans in danger of even deadlier shootings, such as the Q Club shooting, where a stabilizing brace helped the shooter kill 5 people and injured 19 more at an LGBTQ club. Once again, you think all of these mass shooters that result in the deaths of all these people just put on these braces because they felt like giving some money to the plastic industry? They did it because it made the weapon more effective, more accurate, and more lethal. You saw it in the video. Stop the charade. Leave the ATF alone so we can stop this dangerous killing of our constituents. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just be brief. I remember in Judiciary in the 117th Congress, we had a similar discussion and a similar debate. And quite honestly, a lot of the members had no idea kind of what we were talking about or how the nomenclature of any type of firearm can be changed or the uniqueness in and around it, or that the caliber and certainly the ability to utilize any type of firearm it is sometimes in just the eye of the beholder. And, you know, there are many people that I know, including members of my family, that utilize many different types of rifles for, you know, the 9-day gun season for deer hunting in Wisconsin, in which over 400,000 individuals go safely into the woods for 9 days and hopefully get a deer. So it's once again, I just wanted to remind the committee that you can focus on the tragedies that have happened across this nation, but also you have to remember those that continually, on a regular basis, are gun owners and should be protected by the Second Amendment. The focus of this discussion that we have continued to have, Congress after Congress, is misplaced. And I think that just had to be brought forth again this evening.
Well, gentlemen,
and I would yield back.
Gentlemen, yield.
Yielded. Chair.
I think the gentleman for yield. I think we're making it too complicated. This is, as Mr. Massey said, a 4-ounce plastic accessory created for disabled veterans by a veteran, now used by approximately 40 million Americans. And 10 years ago and 5 months, November 26, 2012, the ATF said, just fine, no problem. Now here they are 10 years later, changing their mind, and they just did it. We didn't do it, as Mr. Massey pointed out. Democrats had the Congress last 2 years. They passed a bunch of gun legislation through this committee. They could have done this. They didn't do it. The ATF did it. No bill that came to committee, no bill that went to the House floor, no bill that went to the Senate, no bill signed by the president. They just did it. And now 40 million Americans, if you don't destroy the brace, destroy the gun, get a longer barrel, or register your firearm, you're a felon. And as Mr. Massey pointed out, a bunch of Americans don't even know it. They don't even know. They're in some states where they can't. That's the problem. So you guys introduce the legislation if you want, but we should get rid of this rule that is going to cause so much harm to so many Americans, many of them, the type of Americans that Mr. Fitzgerald just described, who like to hunt, particularly deer hunt in Wisconsin. That's how simple this is. Do it the right way. Pass it through Congress if you want to do it. Don't chip away at the Second Amendment by having bureaucrats do it. The ATF do it when 10 years ago in 5 months they said it was just fine. Yield back to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Yield back, Chairman.
Gentleman, yield.
Those have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from California seeks recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Mr. McClintock.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. McClintock, offered by
Without
Mr.
objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is simple. It would exempt individuals fleeing communist and totalitarian regimes from Section 104. We should exempt people fleeing communist and totalitarian dictatorships from this legislation and allow them to apply for asylum as our laws were intended. The underlying bill would bar individuals who cross the border between ports of entry from seeking asylum. This means individuals would be forced to wait in Mexico to cross the border and be processed. That would make people fleeing communist and totalitarian regimes sitting ducks for the cartels for exploitation, abuse, kidnapping, or murder. We have seen what happens when people are forced to wait in Mexico for too long. Under the Remain in Mexico program, there were over 1,500 publicly reported cases of murder, rape, torture, kidnapping, and other violent assaults against migrants returned under the Remain in Mexico program. In fact, just last month, we saw what happens when vulnerable migrants are put at risk, when migrants in an immigration center in Ciudad Juarez were left to be burned alive. This is not the fate we want for anyone, and we don't want people fleeing totalitarian dictatorships like people fleeing Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua or Russia or China or Vietnam or elsewhere to have to face those kind of dangers. There was a time when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle claimed to oppose communism and totalitarian dictatorships and welcomed people fleeing those horrible regimes. The underlying bill suggests otherwise. I urge my colleagues to join in this amendment so that those fleeing asylum are not put at those fleeing persecution by these communist regimes are not put at additional risk by having to wait for long periods of time in dangerous places before they can lawfully apply for asylum.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Will you yield for the clarifying question?
You could seek your own recognition. I'm going to yield back to the chair.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman seek recognition?
I guess so.
The point of order is withdrawn, and Mr. Gaetz is recognized.
Thank you. I yield to the sponsor. If the sponsor would be willing to engage in a colloquy with me, would you consider the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to be a totalitarian dictatorship?
Mr. Gaetz, I give the same answer that Representative Lofgren gave before. These are not new terms of art. These are the terms used in current law. And so we are merely applying current law to protect people, and in particular, in this case, those that are fleeing communist dictatorships. If the gentleman, his objection is that this definition is overbroad.
No.
You yield it to me.
I'm asking you a clarifying question.
If you would yield, if you would respond to my question, which is, if this amendment is narrowed to communist dictatorships, will you support it?
Well, again, Mr. Schiff, I'm just trying to understand what
Yes,
your
your
amendment
answer is
says.
no, then, Mr. Gaetz.
Well, that you perhaps assume too much, my
Then
friend.
your answer is
because
yes.
I'm asking what you mean by totalitarian dictatorship and just whether the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would qualify. It's just a yes or no question.
Well, I certainly think.
Forgive me for not knowing the list that Ms. Lofgren.
Would you like an answer, Mr. Gaetz? I certainly
attempting a second
consider
time.
Saudi Arabia to be a dictatorship. Yes, I do.
A totalitarian one?
Mr. Gaetz, my question is, if your problem with this amendment is you think it's
Mr.
overbroad.
Schiff, I'm not stating a problem with the amendment. I am merely asking you what it means.
My question then, Mr. Gaetz, is will
What
you
is the
support
difference
it?
between a dictatorship and a totalitarian dictatorship?
My question.
Since Saudi Arabia is a dictatorship.
There is a difference between totalitarianism and dictatorship.
Well, sure, I'm asking you to explain the differences of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
That's really the question, Mr. Gaetz.
Why can't you just answer whether or not your amendment would apply to them?
Mr. Gaetz, this is just a rhetorical exercise.
It's
if you're
a
interested,
serious effort to understand whether or not your amendment
if your
applies to the
question
kingdom.
is sincere, which I know assumes too much, but if it is, then will you support the amendment confined to communist dictatorships? Yes or no, Mr. Gaetz?
I'm probably not going to support the amendment either way. That
Well,
doesn't
there
mean
you go.
I don't
There you
want to
go.
know what it means.
Then what about all the rhetoric you constantly espouse about standing up to communism? Here you're saying someone fleeing communism, if they're interdicted between ports, then they will not qualify.
Right,
Doesn't
because
matter what kind of
there is
regime.
a mechanism by which one seeks asylum for those very reasons, and it's not showing up and creating an entire
So this
loophole in
whole
the
thing
asylum
about Saudi
system.
Arabia is just a red herring, right?
I'm
Mr. Gaetz?
just curious to know whether or not you
Well,
consider them
I
qualifying under the
appreciate
bill.
your
and I
curiosity, but
I would burned
appreciate
2.5 minutes. And it's just a simple question.
consistency.
You know, Mr.
I
Schiff,
would
people on the
appreciate
border
consistency
don't get to have a
more than
debate like this
curiosity.
like you know how to.
I
It's
would
not your time,
appreciate
Mr.
it
Schiff. I'm
if you
reclaiming
would
my
stand
time.
up to
Mr.
communism
Gaetz has the time.
the
Mr.
way
Gaetz has
you
the
say
time.
you do.
Mr. Gaetz has the time.
Look, on the border, someone doesn't get to have this joyful little colloquy with you. A Border Patrol agent has to look at someone and assess whether or not they're going to let them in or not. And I'm just, for clarity, even though I'm not going to support your amendment, I'm going to support the bill. In the unlikely event that your amendment were to be adopted, I simply want to know if someone encounters someone from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, whether or not the exception that your amendment affords would allow that or not.
As I said, I'm using the existing definition, Mr. Gaetz. My
So
question
does
to
that
you
definition
is,
include the
my
kingdom or
question
not?
to you is, will
This
you
is
live
insane.
up to
You
your
just have to answer the
anti-communist rhetoric?
question,
Will
Mr.
you
Schiff.
live up to your anti-communist rhetoric, or is it just a lot of talk from you, Mr. Gaetz?
I don't think you have to blow a
I
hole
guess
through the
it's
asylum
just
system to
a lot
oppose
of talk.
communism.
I guess it's just a lot of talk with you. Nothing more than a lot of
It's
empty
all, I just
talk.
want to know if the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is included or excluded. How is this so difficult for you?
Well,
Do you have any compassion for the people who would have to make this assessment on the border? I just want to know.
Would you care for me to read the code section to you?
Gladly.
The existence of a single political party organized on a dictatorial basis with so close an identity between such party and its policies and the government policies of the country in which it exists, and the party and the government constitute an indistinguishable unit, and the forcible suppression of opposition to such party. That is how the code currently defines a totalitarian party
would you define Saudi
and a
Arabia that way or not?
totalitarian dictatorship.
Would you define them
if
that way or
you-
not, Adam?
So if you wanted to know, read the code. But the
But would
question
you apply
is
to
not.
them or not?
The
It's your
question is
amendment.
not whether you can read the code. The question is
wrote the
whether you
amendment,
stand
and you
for
can't say
anything,
whether it
Mr.
applies
Gaetz.
to a specific
The question
country.
is, do
Why
you
does this
stand?
pain you so
do you
much?
stand for anything? Does anything you say mean anything to you?
I merely am seeking your
Are
own
you
ability
really
to define
so
your own
soft?
amendment.
Are you really so soft on communism now, Mr. Gaetz? I am shocked.
Soft on communism?
So
You're soft on definitions
you would
within
accept,
your own
you would,
bill.
You would
Soft on the
prosecute.
basics of
you
the
would
English
prosecute
language.
and
Soft on the
deny
interpretation
asylum
statute
to someone
mechanisms
fleeing
by which a Border
communism,
Patrol agent
merely
would have to apply
because they
this.
won't
You know what? A
wait
Border
in
Patrol
Mexico
agent isn't
to
going to
be
have this.
Mercifully, the
marginalized.
gentleman is out of time. Mercifully, the gentleman is out of time. Okay. Woo.
Should we have unanimous consent to
No,
continue?
no, everybody's out of time. Everybody's out of time. Does anyone seek recognition?
Is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I offer an amendment now that is being distributed that people will be able to see. I will take up, there's 3 parts to the amendment. I will discuss the first part last. The second part being a rule of construction that is in reference to unaccompanied alien children with respect to what we're amending with TVPRA. I know we will be debating that subject at length later, but this is simply a rule of construction to make sure and clarify certain specific provisions, a screening of such a child for a credible fear of return to his or her country of origin, screening of such a child to determine whether he or she was a victim of trafficking. Department of Health and Human Services policy in effect on the date of enactment of this act requiring a home study for such a child if he or she is under 12 years of age. We believe this will help just clarify and ensure the intent of what we're trying to do with provisions relating to unaccompanied alien children, ensuring that they're returned safely to their families. As we currently do under our current law, this is just trying to align that with what we do with Mexico and Canada, for example, and that this is just some clarifying language. The next section, with respect to detention facilities, the issue is the concern has been raised about how much we have with respect to detention, with some concerns about whether or not that means people will not be allowed into the country. and be detained for the adjudication of asylum claim. So this language would say that we should return the detention facilities to the level that were in operation in January of 2021, and to ensure, I think, at least another 5,000 beds to ensure that we have sufficient detention facilities to have people housed during the adjudication of a claim. We think that's an important part of this as well, so we're putting that forward. And finally, and most importantly, legislative process works best when we have engaged in thorough conversation. We're having a thorough debate and conversation on our side of the aisle, while unfortunately my colleagues on the other side of the aisle bury their head in the sand and refuse to acknowledge the crisis at the border. So we have been going through making sure we've got language to accomplish the objective that we've had from the beginning, which is to ensure that we no longer release people into the United States contrary to existing law, and in so doing, ensure that we are giving people the ability to have a legitimate claim to asylum for credible fear of persecution for the religious beliefs or political beliefs, that those individuals will be given the ability to have that asylum claim heard, but without allowing this administration continue to abuse the asylum laws and the parole laws, which we'll discuss later, by releasing people into the United States, which is causing the magnet, which is empowering cartels, which is empowering China, which is causing migrants to die, which is causing Americans to die, which is causing fentanyl to come into the United States. And we're seeking to stop that. So we have agreed to strike the section that is in this amendment, which would be the provision that had been a part of H.R. 29. We're maintaining a piece of H.R. 29 that is the part for the required suspension of entry. We believe that we have found a better way to do that to ensure that people have, that the intent of what we are trying to do ensures that individuals will have their asylum claims heard, but that the rule of law will sustain, and that we'll be able to either detain or have expedited removal or have safe third country, or be able to have people await in Mexico and otherwise have their claims to asylum be heard. That is the intent of what we're trying to accomplish. So we are working to do that by offering this amendment to strike that particular section in the draft amendment in the nature of a substitute that everybody has. With that, I would yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? One second. There's a gentlelady from California System.
I'm sorry, this is a long amendment. We're trying to figure it out. I do withdraw my point of order.
Okay. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am in support of the Roy Amendment. There should be uniform rules in this country for how unaccompanied children are treated when they come to our border. We shouldn't have a different set of rules for different countries, and unfortunately that confusion is what we see in the system now. The fixes that undergird the philosophy of the Roy Amendment actually have been supported throughout time by both Democrats and Republicans. In 2014, when we had a crisis of unaccompanied children at our border, then President Obama requested that Congress amend the law that created the incentives for children to come to the United States without parents or authorization. And even in 2021, President Biden, when speaking freely and pressed by a reporter, stated that he also thought that an unaccompanied alien child arriving at our border should be sent home to a parent or family member and not be allowed to stay in the United States. But unfortunately, as a matter of policy, the Biden administration has removed key safeguards for security and even background vetting of many of the sponsors of unaccompanied children at the border. I recall vividly a codel that Congressman Biggs led down to the border, where we heard from Border Patrol agents about how at times the same children were being used over and over again in these smuggling operations. I know that's not what any of us want, but while our heartstrings may direct us to the thought that we should allow unaccompanied children into the country, we don't have to guess. We know, as a matter of history, that the consequence of that policy decision is that more unaccompanied children will be sent, and that the United States will be deeper into the human smuggling business. I would finally observe that in these cases, if we change the rules, the gangs notice it too. And you'll see MS-13 and Sinaloa cartel as an enterprise work to try to recruit folks in that 14, 15, 16-year-old range, 17 years old, because they know that they will be paroled into the country absent these fixes. And that will be the new generation of gang talent. 20-year-old Kayla Hamilton was raped and murdered last summer by one of the unaccompanied children who entered the country during the Biden administration and who the secretary lost track of. That unaccompanied child was reportedly a 17-year-old MS-13 gang member. In my state of Florida, there are many patriotic Americans whom, when they think of unaccompanied children, we recall the Pedro Pan flights that brought so many from communist Cuba into the country and where so many Catholic charities were willing to facilitate adoptions throughout our land. But what we see now is very different. We see a highly sophisticated smuggling ring that will respond to the incentives that we build into the law. When we created incentives in the law that so long as you had a kid with you, that was like a fast pass into the country, that was a way to evade detention, then every time you encountered an adult at that border, they were clinging on to a minor child. And those minor children, sadly, were recycled and abused and tormented, and it was our laws that allowed it. And so I would strongly encourage the adoption of the Roy Amendment, not as a way to spurn our compassion, but as a way to embrace it, as a way to understand that the best place for a child to be is with their parent. And let us not create a pipeline of children into the country with massive strain on our social safety nets, on the systems that we have for American children who are often in need and who often see the services that our government provides diluted by these very incentives and features. I would yield my remaining minute to Mr. Roy if he had anything to add.
Well, I think the gentleman from Florida was the gentleman from Florida here when I introduced two articles from the New York Times into the record that outlined the extent to which children are being abused, sold into the human trafficking slavery business into the United States as we speak, and outlining how 85,000 children had been lost. 85,000 children had just simply been lost by the federal government in all of this compassion oozing out of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Is the gentleman aware of that when I introduced that record?
Yeah, and keenly aware of it, and keenly aware that that doesn't happen by accident. That happens as a direct consequence of the choices we make. And so as we endeavor to move this immigration legislation to the floor, I believe that this is one of the most important amendments that we will vote on, one of the most important features of the bill, because it allows us to ensure that we have children with their parents and not on a treacherous journey that results in abuse and exploitation.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I oppose this amendment, but I'm very glad that my Republican colleagues have realized that the bill actually did send all unaccompanied children seeking safety at the border back to Mexico. That's what it did. And your amendment, I think, because we had a number of amendments prepared to see if y'all really cared about children, as you've been saying you do, I think you adjusted that. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. However, the bill is still unworkable and still cruel and inhumane. And I want to give you one example. In your amendment, you call for a number of detention centers to be reopened, including the Irwin Detention Center in Georgia. Well, let me tell you why that detention center was closed. It was actually a resolution that I led in Congress to call for that detention center to be closed because 40 immigrant women had forced non-consensual surgery to sterilize them in that facility by a gynecologist who worked in that facility. It was stunning to see what happened in the Irwin detention facility in Georgia. And that anybody would call for that facility to be reopened, given the history of that, is remarkable to me. And I just want to read you, this is from a New York Times article, September 29th, 2020, one of the testimonies of the women that was in that detention facility that you are now asking to reopen in this amendment. Wendy Dove was startled awake early one morning in January 2019 when guards called her out of her cell block in the Irwin County Immigration Detention Center, where she had been held for 4 months. She would be having surgery that day, they said. Still groggy, the 48-year-old immigrant from Jamaica, who had been living without legal status in the United States before she was picked up, felt a swell of dread coming over her. An outside gynecologist who saw patients in immigration custody told her that the menstrual cramping that she had was caused by large cysts and masses that needed to be removed. She was skeptical, but the doctor insisted, and as a detainee brought to the hospital in handcuffs and shackles, she felt pressured to allow him to take her in. It was only after she was deported and had her medical files reviewed by several other doctors that she realized what had happened to her. This is the facility that you want to open? I'm quite stunned by that. But on top of that, you're saying you want to detain families, and we know that detaining families is bad for children. It's bad for families. It has lifelong traumatic consequences. Let me just remind you of what the CDC advises in terms of where kids should be by age 5. Kids should be able to count to 10. They should name numbers between 1 and 5 when you point to them. They should use words about time, like yesterday, tomorrow, morning, or night. How are they going to learn these in family detention centers? That is an inhumane way to go about anything that we need to do. So I would say that this amendment is extremely misguided. It focuses on putting families in detention. We know that that's not humane, and it continues to be completely unworkable. So I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment, and I yield to my colleague, Ms. Scanlon.
I couldn't agree with you more about this. I mean, certainly the Irwin County medical abuse was absolutely horrific, was in all of the newspapers. Everybody agreed it was outrageous. But we also need to note that the other, all 5 of the immigration detention centers listed here were closed because of inhumane conditions and abuse of immigrant families, children, people who were detained not for criminal activity, but detained while they were awaiting processing of their asylum applications. They were in line, they were following the rules, and they were detained in places that were subhuman. So that's why these places were closed, and the suggestion that they should be reopened is
The person that House Democrats chose to chair the crime subcommittee.
You heard that right.
Said that it was a mandate to defund the police. And now, on Police Week, when the majority is seeking to simply pass a resolution honoring the police, we are being accused of taking cheap shots at Democrats when not any Democrat, literally the person they put in charge of the crime sub, is that what I'm to understand?
That is indeed what
And I have an inquiry. Is Ms. Bush still on the Judiciary Committee?
we haven't seen her.
No, but it's an honest question. Is she on the?
She has a name tag down there.
Well, I mean, I'd say it would be great, Mr. Chairman, if we had the benefit of Ms. Bush in committee so as to allow her to espouse these views and subject them to debate.
Would the gentleman yield?
No, it's my time.
I'm sorry, I'll yield back to Mr. Johnson.
Well,
but I will gladly, upon the opportunity to take time, engage in a colloquy on
I
this.
just want to ask about your
mystifying
ATF
of-
defund.
Well, no, hold on. This
Totally for it. Wish we had the defund the ATF bill up this week if I ran the place.
But wait a minute,
Feel free.
Mr. Gaetz. Wait, I have a minute left. I know this is painful, but I've got to get some of these zingers in here because Representative Ocasio-Cortez said after they cut $1 billion from New York's police department, she said, quote, that didn't go far enough. Defunding police means defunding police. Representative Jones, Mondaire Jones, said that a suite of criminal justice reforms to redress racial inequalities and harms in our justice system, including defunding police, reinvesting this money, et cetera, et cetera. It just goes on and on. Representative Omar, oh boy, she was all over this issue. She said we need to completely dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department, completely. Because here's the thing, there's a cancer
The Minneapolis Police Department is rotten to the root, and so when we dismantle it, we get rid of that cancer. Representative Presley, Ayanna Presley, said, the defund movement isn't new. Folks are just finally listening. We got monies for war, but we can't feed the poor. Tlaib, I'll end with this. She said, when we say hashtag defund the police, what we mean is people are dying and we need to invest in people's livelihoods instead. Listen, we have the receipts, y'all. Don't try to bring this argument in here again. I got a lot more, but I'm out of time.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman, the ranking member is recognized, Mr. Natter from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did indeed say that we should defund the police. Well, what I meant was, and what was done, was that we should reallocate some of the resources to mental health. Because it doesn't make sense when you're dealing with a mentally ill person in a subway to send a cop with a gun. What you need is a mental health worker who can take care of that person. And that was done. And it has worked. And that's why, or it's part of the reason why New York is the safest large city in the United States today in terms of crime. And I note that my Republican colleagues who are so upset at defunding the police want to defund the federal police, the FBI, the ATF. How can you be in favor of funding local police but not the federal police? They have a major function. Who is going to catch the spies? Who's going to catch the bank robbers? Who's going to be the modern John Dillinger? Or Elliot Ness, rather, not John Dillinger, the modern Elliot Ness. John Dillinger was the bad guy. We need the ATF, we need the FBI, just as we need local police departments. So it is hypocritical for Republicans to criticize the Democrats for wanting to defund the police when they want to defund the federal police. And when I can't speak for other members, what they meant on their comments, but for myself, what I meant in defunding the police was shifting funds, not defunding, shifting funds from the police to the mental health, which, as I said, was done and has worked out very well. I'll yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I mean, these are your words. You said, quote, there should be substantial cuts to the police budget, unquote. So they cut $1 billion.
Yes. Matt Gaetz first.
Thank the gentleman for yielding, Mr. Chairman. I think what we just observed was a drive-by committee presence from the gentlelady from Missouri. And what I would reflect on is that if someone is the victim of an armed robbery, they don't need a green space. They need a local government willing to fund their local police department. If someone is about to be stabbed, as one of the witnesses was at our field hearing in New York, they don't need a therapist. They need force to be able to respond back, and they need the law on their side, which is why I've introduced a national stand your ground bill that I believe the committee ought to hear. And if your car's being broken into, you don't need wraparound services. You need a detective. Day in and day out, people in the communities run by Democrats feel less safe. And the reason they feel less safe is because they don't feel like the law is on their side. And by the way, funding up the FBI and the ATF and the censorship industrial complex at the DHS isn't what they need. It's local police, and those are the folks whose backs we have and who you all have spent years denigrating.
Gentleman yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. Does the gentleman wish to speak on the bill, or we got an amendment coming? I'll recognize if you. I
appreciate it, Mr.
Right.
Chairman. I just want to say this. I mean, I think the rhetoric's over the top down there. I mean, I was a prosecutor for 12 years. I've been endorsed by the FOP every time I've run for office. People in my jurisdiction, by the way, don't want to get rid of the FBI and the ATF. They're very glad that we have them. When I was a prosecutor, we coordinated our prosecutions with them. It's called Project Exile. I believe it was started by the Bush administration, by the way. But we tried to do that to get gun offenders off the streets and to make sure that serial offenders got more jail time because they got more serious sentences in the federal courts. The FBI and the ATF led those efforts in those prosecutions. And by the way, the Sinaloa cartel takedown that just happened 2 weeks ago, there were no local police involved with that. You know why? They don't have jurisdiction to do it. FBI, ATF, Homeland Security all were involved in those in that takedown. When you guys complain about not doing enough to stop fentanyl, guess who it is that's working it? It's FBI, it's ATF, it's DEA, all these federal agencies that you want to get rid of. We need them to do that work. I think we also need the local police to do the work too. And if you find some place where Glenn Ivey said defund the police, I'd love to see it. But I think we need both. I'm glad that you all see the need to have, I think I'm hearing today, federal law enforcement handle cases as well. We need the Department of Justice, we need the FBI, we need the ATF, we need the DEA. We need help from all of them to deal with the major international problems that we've got going. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes himself. Yield to the gentleman from Florida.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I wouldn't want anyone in the minority on the committee to be of the view that we think that every single Democrat holds the defund the police view. Matter of fact, we don't think that, and I think the gentleman was correct in referencing we've got Democrats who've been a part of keeping our community safe, and we thank you for that. You're patriots for offering to do that. But when the Democratic Party elevates to the position of chair of the crime subcommittee, the very leader of the defund police movement, you don't have to be for the defund police movement to be supportive of, I think, some pretty dangerous platforming of ideas that make people in our communities less safe. And there's been much discussion of these crime rates. And what I've noticed is that in some places, the crime rate may be higher in red places because those crimes are actually acknowledged practically with arrests and criminal process, where in a lot of places like New York, things like shoplifting aren't even a crime anymore.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
I would.
Would you agree that it's helpful to have the FBI, the ATF, the DEA, and the Department of Justice to prosecute federal crimes? Would you think it's a good idea to keep them around?
Just as you've not called to defund the local police, I haven't called to completely defund the FBI. What I've said is if they don't come to heel, and if they are not responsive and constrained by their authorities, because Mr. Ivey, I think it is fair.
Gentleman from Florida controls time.
I think it is fair to be critical of an ATF that imposes zero tolerance on people, and then they lose their own guns. They keep records in the hundreds of thousands they're not
Would the
supposed to
gentleman
keep,
yield?
and then they don't.
I just want to ask about your legislation.
Yeah,
because your legislation is one line,
yeah,
and all it says is we're going to shut down the ATF. It doesn't say anything about all of the other stuff you just mentioned.
Well, that's because I was talking about the
FBI.
As to the ATF, I would invite your co-sponsorship to that legislation.
I think it's crazy. Why would you want to defund the ATF?
Because the ATF has so greatly exceeded their authority, they are punishing regular Americans with no basis and soaked in the hypocrisy of seizing documents and holding records that even the Department of Justice, the vaulted Department of Justice that you talk about, their own Inspector General is hammering the ATF. And so that's why I think they maybe need a shot across the bow. But the folks out in our communities that are battling against
actually the time belongs to me. I've yielded to the gentleman.
The folks that are out in our communities, like the witnesses at our field hearing, they count on a cop in their community, and they count on a local government able, willing, determined to fund those local cops. And you heard from an investigator that represented a lot of the detectives out of New York tell you how the advocacy of these policies, which I certainly would agree not every Democrat holds, but your leadership.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
Certainly.
Okay, so your bill, which you just called a shot across the bow,
correct?
Defund ATF. You think that's a good message to law enforcement?
I think it's a good message to the folks at ATF who are breaking the law.
Well, I tell you what, let's target them. I don't think you have to shut down hold on. You don't have to shut down the whole agency to address any bad apples. That's the same thing with police departments.
But similarly,
at the
Mr.
local
Ivey,
level.
but similarly,
That's
you
what
don't have to
IGs are
maintain the entire agency to do the things that you've talked about regarding the Sinaloa cartel. Just as you may suggest, not every single person at the ATF is a bad person, and I don't think they are. I don't think you need to keep the entire apparatus either. So yes, on the continuum of the ATF, I believe they have done more harm than good when it comes to people's civil liberties, and when it comes to some of these other federal agencies, they do need to come to heel. So that, by the way, Democrats used to believe in civil liberties. You guys used to actually think that when government overreached and violated people's constitutional rights, there was a bad thing.
I must say, we
And
we
you
still
guys,
do. We still do.
So long as these federal agencies will go after Trump and Republicans, they seem to get a lot more attention from you.
I got to say, I've been at this a lot longer than when Trump was president. And we've been able to challenge the FBI, the ATF. I've been on both sides of this. When they cross the line, you prosecute them, you fire them, you deal with
But
that.
see, all we could do is defund them.
But saying you're going to shut the whole thing down.
Our power is the power of the purse, and we have to be able to use it. And that way, if you've been on both sides of this issue...
Did you send a letter to the IG saying you need to target these bad apples in particular?
We send so many letters to the IG highlighting the things that we're finding in our investigations. And if you've been on both sides, what I would say is, what are you waiting for to get back on our side, on the correct side?
I'm waiting to get back on the majority so we can actually focus on laws
when you were in the majority,
that deal with gun violence
to protect people's rights
and bring down the gun
these
violence.
agencies with all the powers that they've now weaponized against the people.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much. I've got an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment to H. Con. Res. 40, offered by Mr. Schiff of
Gentleman
California.
from Arizona reserves a point of order. Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from California is recognized for his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment is very simple. It inserts language expressing opposition to the Abolish the ATF Act of 2023, which would eliminate the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. Immediately after that bill's enactment, it expresses opposition to that bill as a dangerous effort to defund the police and harm local law enforcement. And just in case members are unfamiliar with what we would be abolishing under that legislation, the ATF's responsibilities include investigation and prevention of federal offenses involving the unlawful use, manufacture, and possession of firearms and explosives. I was led to believe for many years that the Republican mantra was, we don't need any new gun laws, we should enforce the ones that we have. But apparently, today, they don't even want those laws enforced. More than that, the ATF also combats illegal trafficking of alcohol and tobacco. I guess my GOP friends don't think we should be doing that either. The ATF also operates a fire research laboratory where they examine ways of detecting criminal arson. I guess we want to abolish their ability to do that. ATF uses its legislative mandate to investigate and recommend prosecution of offenders to reduce the level of violent crime and hence public safety. I guess we want to abolish those efforts. ATF strives to increase state and local awareness of available federal prosecution under the statutes and works to curb the illegal use of firearms, enforce firearm laws. ATF issues firearms licenses. I guess we don't want to issue any firearms licenses anymore either. They also work on combating the import, manufacture, and dealing in explosive materials. So I guess we're going to abolish those efforts. As well as the special response teams, which are elite tactical groups that respond to high-risk law enforcement operations. So we don't want them to be able to do that in conjunction with local law enforcement. So that's what that bill would do, Mr. Gaetz' bill. It is, one of the clearest efforts to defund law enforcement. And given that this underlying bill is about expressing our opposition to efforts to defund law enforcement, I presume I'll have the support of my colleagues to express opposition to that effort. And I'm happy to yield to my Republican colleagues if they want to express support for Mr. Gaetz' efforts to defund the ATF. Would any of my Republican colleagues like to express their support for Mr. Gaetz' efforts to defund the ATF?
I think we're going to get to that.
I
think we're going to get to that,
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Jordan, would you like me to yield to you, express your support for Mr. Gaetz' legislation to defund the ATF?
I'm going to yield to Mr. Gaetz.
No, I'm yielding to you, Mr. Jordan.
Well, I'm going to listen to Mr. Gaetz' compelling arguments that I know will be coming, and then we will have a debate.
Reclaiming my time, I'd be happy to yield to you for the purpose of
I appreciate your willingness.
Mr. Jordan, if you let me finish.
I will.
It is my time. I'm happy to yield to you for the purpose of saying yes or no whether you support Mr. Gaetz' efforts to defund the ATF. Do you, Mr. Jordan?
I support Mr. Gaetz' effort to send a message to the ATF, which is what he said
So
just a
you
few
do
minutes
support,
ago in the
you
debate.
support the legislation to defund the ATF?
I didn't say that. I said I support his efforts to send a message to the
bill,
ATF.
The bill that Mr. Gaetz has introduced
changed the
says-
rule after
it
10 years of
it
telling
says
American citizens
that it would abolish, it would eliminate the Bureau immediately after enactment. Do you support that, Mr. Jordan? Yes or no?
I've given my answer.
Do you support it?
I've given my answer.
Yes or no, Mr. Jordan?
I've given my answer, Mr. Schiff.
Okay, I guess your answer is you don't support it, or you're afraid to say that you do. But I'm happy to yield to Mr. Johnson or Mr. Biggs or Mr. McClintock, Mr. Tiffany, Mr. Massey, anyone. Anyone else like to join Mr. Gaetz? And anyone like to anyone like to express their support for Mr. Gaetz' effort to abolish an entire federal law enforcement agency? Anyone over there? Mr. Issa, do you support abolishing the ATF?
Thank you for yielding.
It's a yes or no, Mr.
You and I have
Mr.
served here for almost 22 plus years.
Reclaiming my time, I'm not getting a yes or no from anyone.
I was getting to that.
Well, yes or no?
I'm sorry,
yes
but
or no, Mr. Issa?
What I was saying is
yes
that
or no?
it took 22 years to see you
yes or no,
conducting
Mr.
a
Issa?
deposition of your colleagues, and I appreciate
reclaiming
it, Mr.
my
U.S.
time.
Attorney.
Reclaiming my time. Apparently, Mr. Gaetz is the only one willing to publicly say he supports defunding the ATF. Maybe that's progress, and I hope that will mean
Well,
that
I think there's going to be a vote. I think there's going to be a vote. You're going to know here in a couple
I hope
minutes.
that my colleagues will accept the amendment. The
gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from
Excuse me, I'm
Arizona.
reclaiming my time, Mr.
You don't
Chairman.
have any time to reclaim.
Well, I would if you hadn't been speaking over it.
No, you ask us all the questions.
Well, and what's the answer,
The
Mr.
gentleman
Jordan?
from Arizona
What's the answer? Do you
withdraws his point of
support
order.
abolishing the ATF, Mr. Jordan?
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate this interest in the legislation I've offered, and many of the features of government that are important that Mr. Schiff points out occur in other areas. They don't occur only in the ATF. Now, the ATF is an agency that has totally exceeded any sense of authorization. And by the way, it's not even an authorized entity of government. It just continues to get funded. And what have they done with that funding? Not according to me, but according to the Department of Justice's own Inspector General, they have failed to secure their facilities, and then they have violated people's civil liberties and rights by maintaining electronic records that they have no legal authority to maintain. Did they do that to just a few of them?
Will the gentleman
No,
yield?
hundreds of thousands of times they broke the law.
Mr. Gaetz,
And the
would you yield?
reason that that's problematic
Time
in a
belongs to the gentleman from
circumstance
Florida.
in
Mr.
which
Gaetz.
the ATF continues to grow beyond their limits is
Mr.
because
Gaetz, would
they
you
are
yield?
now imposing on, I'm defending my bill, Mr. Schiff, they are now imposing on regular Americans a sense of zero tolerance that isn't for public safety. They're putting people out of business, like those who are contacting each of our offices who have some Scrivener's error or technical violation that oftentimes isn't even the fault of the individual that the ATF is bringing hellfire down on from a regulatory sense. So yes, I do believe that the current structure of the ATF is absolutely not worth vindicating or funding or continuing in its operational setting.
In that case, would you yield, Mr. Gaetz?
I'll yield, Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Gaetz, can you identify any of your Republican colleagues on this committee who are supporting your bill?
Well, I can identify one, and then I'll get back to my remark. Mr. Biggs is a co-sponsor. I don't know if anybody else is. I'd invite your co-sponsorships.
Okay, so
there are people here supporting. Look, we're going to see in the vote.
Two
but the
Republican
important
members
thing is,
who favor abolishing the
Gentlemen,
entire
I
police
can't list every
agency.
supporter. I tell you what, you can get on the
Any other
legislative format.
takers?
I control the time. And you can get on and see that there's a handful of members who've co-sponsored the legislation. I would encourage everyone to do so because the ATF has been weaponized. And again, I repeat, this is not a partisan conclusion. The Department of Justice Inspector General was appointed by President Obama. He's an Obama appointee. And not only do they point out the high frequency at which the ATF violates the law, then they point out the recalcitrance of that agency to even follow the recommendations that have been set forth by the Inspector General. So sometimes when you get an agency that goes rogue, as the ATF has, it is the right time to start with a fresh sheet of paper. And that is not to say that every function of the ATF is a bad function of government. It is saying that this particular agency cannot meet those functions, and that's a position that's held not just by me, not just by my co-sponsors, some of whom, at least one of whom, is on this committee. It's something that at least in the factual articulations of the deficiencies of the agency as articulated by inspectors general. There's also a GAO report. There's also a GAO report that goes over records maintenance that excoriates the ATF, and that is also not a partisan entity. That is a nonpartisan entity that has a watchdog.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I'll yield.
If you acknowledge that there are multiple functions that the ATF currently performs that should not be abolished, wouldn't it have made sense to say in your bill, other than we're abolishing the ATF immediately, to provide some sort of transition for those functions to other agencies, to transition for the funding,
I would say
pending cases
I would say that
are in court?
is certainly something I'd be willing to work with you on. I'm open-minded as
I don't
to
want
the
to get rid
transfer
of the
those
ATF,
functions.
so I'm not working
Well, that's
with
the
you on
problem,
that.
right? You don't want to get rid. Democrats. I'm sorry. I'll address the chair as we're entitled to do. My objective here with House Democrats is to try to build a system that adheres to the values that many House Democrats used to espouse regarding protecting individuals from too much government surveillance and too much government overreach. And the ATF has done that. That has been the conclusion of multiple entities that have observed their conduct. They haven't fixed the things that they were told wrong. And so, yes, I would start with a blank sheet of paper, and I don't think support for my measure in any way binds someone to the theory that these functions of government are not appropriate. But I do not trust the ATF to do those things. I really don't. I think that they're too busy going after law-abiding gun owners, and because I don't trust them to do the important things.
So you literally want to abolish, now earlier you said it was a shot across the bow. You literally want to abolish the agency in toto, immediately.
I would get rid of the funding we currently have through ATF for those functions, and I would reorient it where it does not go through ATF. And I would start that work tomorrow.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who seeks recognition? Question occurs on the amendment from the gentleman from California. All those in favor say yes. Aye. Now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And after serving in our state legislature in Florida, now here in the Congress, I've come to learn that the more I see of government, the less of it I want. And that seems to be the reaction increasingly of our constituents who face woke and weaponized agencies with seemingly unlimited authority to be able to impact regulatory costs. And I've heard the minority debate against the underlying REINS Act and for these various carve-outs in terms that would scare people. We wouldn't be able to make decisions. Our process would be frozen. Chaos would ensue. I'm here to tell you we have test cases that empirically prove that to be false. The very first piece of legislation I passed in the state legislature was the Florida version of the REINS Act that said that if regulatory costs were at a certain level, the agency could be compelled to produce a lower cost regulatory alternative. And they would have to defend that, and if they could not, then that particular regulatory action would not have the force of law. And all of the things that my colleagues in the minority have been saying did not happen. Why? Because if agencies have to defend their conduct, there is a deterrent effect against inappropriate agency action. In the Florida legislature, we actually meet a lot less than here in the United States Congress. And they haven't had to review hundreds or thousands of these regulations that exceed the authority. In those circumstances, the legislature, I think, has put the right constraint on the administrative state so that everyone could stay in their lanes. And so if the animation does not come from a sincere desire to save us from chaos, then why would the minority in this case not want the politically elected representatives of the people to be the lawmakers? And I think the real reason is that they want to divorce the painful decisions that bureaucrats make from political accountability. Because regular folks don't get to go vote against somebody with green eye shades in a windowless cubicle at the IRS building. They vote for or against their representatives in a republic. And so that's what this is really all about, being able to ensure that where people feel pain in terms of complying with laws, so these are the people who want to comply and feel an economic pain as a consequence, and where the agency cannot produce a lower cost regulatory alternative, we think the obligation should be on the Congress. And That is, I think, the better representation of good governance. That's certainly been our experience in Florida. And if there is a state that has done what mine has and has adopted a state-level version of this to constrain their state government, and it has resulted in the hysteria that we hear from the minority, I look forward to hearing that case study. Seeing none of my colleagues that seek further time, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question occurs on the amendment from the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 52, printed in House Report number 118-142, offered by Mr. Gaetz of Florida.
Pursuant to House Rule 583, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
There is a time in every debate where everything has been said, but not yet by everyone. And that may be where we are in the DEI debate, but what I bring to the House now is the most fulsome amendment to completely remove DEI from the DoD. And even if my amendment doesn't pass, I want my colleagues to know that this NDAA in the base bill takes a meat cleaver to DEI. And the amendments that we have adopted in the last round of voting have certainly ensured that DEI, regardless of the passage or not of my amendment, will not be a principal feature of our military service if this bill becomes law, and that would be a great thing for our military. That said, it's important to note that in the name of DEI, our military has done some pretty strange things. Secretary Austin, in his first act, ordered a 24-hour stand down so that everyone could reflect on their extremism. The reality is, even majority-minority units in the military found this divisive. They complained to my office, and certainly it did not create a more lethal force. Also, in the name of DEI, we've hired some rather strange people in the government. There's one DEI officer named Calissa Wing, and she actually, if you can believe this, worked in the DEI's department at DODOA, the education system within DOD, and she put out the following inclusive tweet. I'm so exhausted at these white folks in these professional development sessions. This lady actually had the audacity to say that black people can be racist too. I had to stop the session and give Karen the business. This was the person that we had hired to create a more inclusive environment, and I think it's indicative of the inherently divisive culture that has permeated radical racial ideology. My amendment gives us the opportunity to pull it up by the root, and I hope my colleagues support it. I would add this final point before yielding back. We have standards in the military that allow the military to expel racists and white supremacists completely in the absence of DEI programs. We've had those standards in the military for quite some time. And so even if my amendment were to become law, I don't want anyone in the body to think that we would be stuck with people in the military that didn't meet long-standing, pre-existing standards of personal conduct. And with that, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Virginia. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Virginia seek recognition?
I rise to claim the time in opposition to the amendment, and I yield 1.5 minutes to Mr. Horsford.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to this amendment. Mr. Speaker, the previous speaker, the maker of this amendment, talked about being exhausting. This issue that he has brought before this body and the committee is exhausting. Just this week, the sponsor of this amendment called diversity, equity, and inclusion in the military a, quote, failed experiment. He has called it cancerous. Just this week, a senator from Alabama stated that it was his opinion that white nationalists are not necessarily racist and refused to denounce white nationalists serving in the military. All of this with the backdrop of the same senator holding up hundreds of military nominations, which is actively hurting our national security, something that this NDAA bill would address. To what end? The U.S. Marine Corps does not have a confirmed commandant as we speak. And yet, just an hour ago, on this very floor, one of the members on the other side of this body said his amendment, quote, had nothing to do whether colored people or black people can serve, unquote. Mr. Speaker, these comments show exactly why we need diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Every day, our military grows more diverse, more and more reflecting the diversity of our nation. This amendment does nothing to address the recruitment shortfalls that our services are facing, and instead it will only make it more difficult to recruit Americans on diverse backgrounds representing the true makeup of our nation. What are you so afraid of? Why do you keep bringing these divisive issues to the body of this floor? You are out of order. You are exhausting, Mr. Gaetz.
The gentleman is no longer recognized. The gentleman is no longer recognized. Woman from Virginia reserves.
I reserve.
Excuse me, a point of order, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
No, Mr. Speaker, I've made a point of order. You have to rule on the point of order.
The gentleman will state his point of order.
The gentleman has an obligation to address the chair, not other members. He did not do that. He was out of order, violating the decorum of the House.
The gentleman has not stated a proper point of order.
A parliamentary inquiry, then. I seek recognition to make a parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his parliamentary.
What is the
question.
parliamentary mechanism that requires an individual to address the chair? Because if it's not that and we can address each other, let's do that for the rest of the debate.
The chair will not engage in this dialogue. Would the gentleman like to be recognized for his 5
I want to be
minutes?
recognized for a parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman is not recognized. Would you
I'm not
like to be
recognized for a parliamentary inquiry? I'm not recognized for a parliamentary
The
inquiry?
chair will not engage with the gentleman.
I have a parliamentary inquiry.
So the gentleman is recognized for his 5 minutes. The gentleman will state his inquiry.
Will the chair encourage members to address the chair and rather than one another?
The chair encourages all members to address the chair and not one another.
Very well. I seek
Thank
recognition.
you. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr.
Can you be respectful? Can we have a debate?
Yeah.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Yeah, thank you,
for
Mr.
his
Speaker.
amendment.
And Mr. Speaker, the childish antics that we just observed indicate that we've got a lot of work to do, both in this House and the military, not to have radical racial ideology governing our discourse and governing the policy choices that we make in these bills. The policy choice that my amendment seeks to make ensures that we do not have the cancer of DEI harming our military. I would yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Florida.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
I would just like to remind people that whether you're white, black, brown, we all bleed the same. So to have this completely divisive ideology being pushed, to have members from across the aisle making it about race, when some of these members have not even served, is completely, to me, not only a foreign ideology, but I'd like to remind people, when you're getting shot at, okay? When my husband was shot in Afghanistan, do you think he was sitting there asking what color the person that was evacuating him was? Do you think he was sitting there wondering about diversity, equity, and inclusion? No, the only thing he cared about was making sure that someone that was evacuating him knew how to do their job. That's what the military needs to be focusing on. So to have it about race just goes to show that maybe more members of across the aisle need to be serving in our military, because that's not something that we focus on. What we focus on is mission readiness. That's what it's all about. I don't care if you guys think that I'm racist. I'm a minority woman. Maybe I'm the wrong color of minority for you, but I'm a minority woman. I support this for those reasons because I've lost friends. Chairman, I yield my time.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. Members are reminded to redirect their remarks to the chair. The gentleman.
I reserve, and I thank the chair for that acknowledgement.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Virginia is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I yield 1 minute to Ms. Takuda.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, it's been said once already on this floor, but I don't think it can be said enough. If we ever needed a reason to support DEI training, you need look no further than the debates the antics that we have seen on this floor today, the childish, yes, actions that we have heard from the other side. In fact, from the backwards, racially insensitive comments spoken on this floor, it seems DEI training would be good right here in the halls of Congress. Chair, we have spent hours in markup already debating DEI, but apparently it wasn't enough. So here we are again, forced to debate yet another bad amendment. Never mind that 40% of our service members identify as members of minority groups, or that 42% of service members of color turn down assignments because of concerns about racism and discrimination that they have experienced. Never mind that almost half of all service members in a recent survey said they've been the subject of racial slurs or jokes in their communities. To say that we do not need DEI is to say racism and discrimination does not exist in our military and in our society. For the sponsor of this amendment to be proud of taking a meat cleaver to DEI flies in the face of all Americans and the diversity that we represent. What this reckless amendment and this obsession over DEI really exposes is a callous disregard for these service members and their experiences.
The gentlewoman's time has expired.
They deserve better. America is better than this, and I strongly urge my colleagues to vote no.
I reserve.
The gentlewoman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can answer the gentlelady's question. If her question is, when will we stop debating DEI? The answer is, when we get rid of DEI in the military. We will be here fighting this fight each and every day, because what fashions itself as an inclusive ideology is in fact inherently divisive and harmful. And I acknowledge that we have many minorities that serve in our military, and we are so grateful for their patriotism, but it's the very minority groups, it's the very minority service members in my district who come and complain about these initiatives. So this isn't an affront to our service members, it is something we are doing for our service members. And you know what they really complain about? A lot of this DEI training that takes away from their jumps, their live fire time, their time in the cockpit. We need to spend more time ensuring that we can protect the homeland and less time on pronoun training and the rest of this nonsense. I reserve.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How much time do we have left?
The gentlewoman has 2.5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this debate today demonstrates exactly why diversity, equity, and inclusion is necessary. Not only in the military, but probably we need some training here in this body. But I'm going to limit my remarks to the armed services. I want to break down what DEI training actually is, because most of the comments I've heard today is not an accurate definition of what DEI is. I'm going to take those words one at a time. Diversity training recognizes that we, in diversity efforts, recognize we need to have a military, we need to have service members, we need to have an officer corps that reflects the diversity of the country that they protect. And for a wide variety of reasons, it doesn't. We need to recognize that our diversity is our strength and our unity is our power, but we can only have unity when we recognize and respect the diversity of this country and the people who serve. Equity recognizes that despite the fact the first casualty of the Revolutionary War was a black man, black men weren't allowed to serve in the military until the Civil War. And until 1948, the service was segregated, and black men, like my uncles, were not allowed combat duty. My uncles were only allowed to cook when they served during World War II. My uncles brought back home stories of the names they were called, of the threats they received, not from the enemy, but from their fellow service members. Their children and grandchildren who heard those stories didn't want to serve in a military that was unwelcoming to them. Inclusion means we are creating an atmosphere and a workplace that is inclusive of the full diversity of everyone who serves. Mr. Speaker, whether we like it or not, the history of this country is complicated. The history of this country is rooted in the original sin of slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow, when black Americans were treated as second citizens, if they were treated as citizens at all. We have to teach that history. And most of the amendments we have seen today have either tried to whitewash that history or ignore that it ever happened. We cannot do it. I urge the body to reject this amendment.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Number 160, printed in Part A of House Report Number 118-216, offered by Mr. Gaetz of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This Congress has authorized $115 billion to Ukraine. My amendment would ensure that this defense appropriations bill sends no more. $115 billion is an astonishing amount of money, especially when you consider that our nation sits atop a $33 trillion debt, and we are facing $2 trillion annual deficits. And it is not as if the $115 billion has brought this conflict any closer to an end. In fact, the massacres and the killing and the death continue. The next statement is so obvious, I can't even believe I have to say it out loud. It does not make the United States of America stronger to borrow money from China to give it to Ukraine. I hear a lot of the war hawks in this Congress stand up and say, well, we have to send a message to China by fighting for however long it takes at whatever cost in Ukraine. The message we're sending to China is that they are engaged in a leveraged buyout of Russia and increasingly of our own country. We've got problems here in America with our own borders. Americans are watching as foreign flags are being erected in the middle of the Rio Grande River while our nation is being invaded tens of thousands every month. And yet we go spend all this money on the border of another country. I do not fear broken Russian tanks rolling through Europe. I fear Russia's nuclear weapons and the risk that we could be sleepwalking into a nuclear conflict that could end life as we know it on the planet, all for what? To live out some neoconservative dream in Ukraine? Give me a break. Right now, a lot of this funding that we've sent for Ukraine has been inflationary. Food and fuel. These are the markets that have been affected globally because of this crisis and because of the money we are spending to extend the conflict. At the beginning of this Congress, Speaker McCarthy said, there's not going to be a blank check to Ukraine. But when we bring witnesses before us to ask them whether or not we're complying with our own laws regarding end-use monitoring of materiel, they cannot say we're even following our own laws. Enough is enough. I'm putting my countrymen first, and I don't think we should send another nickel to Ukraine. I reserve.
The gentleman from Florida reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Here again is an attempt to cut off any support for Ukraine as they fight to defend their country from an illegal Russian invasion. As I said earlier, once again, Putin is attempting to rewrite the map of Europe through the use of force. He's doing so in violation of international law. He is deliberately targeting civilians, as I mentioned, hospitals, daycare centers, apartment buildings. And while he's doing that, yes, he is destroying the economy and the livelihood of Ukrainians in the process. Putin and his thugs, they are committing war crimes on a mass scale. And the United States and the other democratic nations of the world must continue to oppose him. If we do not, then he or another authoritarian leader will try something like this again. Yes, either in Ukraine or elsewhere in the world. Earlier I mentioned, I laid out that America is not alone in its support of Ukraine. Our allies and our partners are donating tanks, air defense systems, artilleries, vehicles, rockets, and infantry fighting vehicles. And this list goes on and on. So let's not abandon our fellow democracies. Let's not abandon the EU and our NATO allies now. Let's not abandon Ukraine. Faced with daunting odds against Russian forces, they have taken up a mantle to defend themselves, defend their values, and our shared democratic principles.
They deserve our continued support. So I understand that my colleague has a different view than I do, but I thank him for a respectful engagement in this discussion, and I urge my colleagues at this time to oppose this amendment. And Madam Chair, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And indeed, this is a respectful policy dispute that we have over this matter, and I am grateful that we are taking up the Defense Appropriations Bill as a single subject bill to work through these things and let the votes fall where they may. But it seems the full sum of the argument against my amendment is Putin bad, which I concede. Matter of fact, Vladimir Putin has sanctioned me personally. So I don't have to be sold on that argument. He's a bad guy. The question is whether after $115 billion, it's the $300 million in this bill that's going to really kick the door in. And there's been no argument that that's the case because, of course, that would not comport with logic and reason. And when my colleagues say we cannot abandon the EU, that is like fingernails on a chalkboard to my fellow Americans who often feel like they are the ones who have been abandoned. As we send $115 billion to Ukraine and ignore what is going on our own border. We also ignore what's going on with a lot of our first responders. In our country, there are police and firemen who do not know if their pension fund will be strong enough to support their benefits throughout their life. We do very little on that front, but we have underwritten the full pension of every civil servant and government employee in Ukraine. Abandon them. I just don't think we should bankroll them. And that's why I would encourage the adoption of my amendment. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I rise as a designee of the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Granger. And Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in opposition to this amendment, which prohibits security assistance for Ukraine. The bill contains funding and conditions for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which is different from the funding that has been included in supplementals for Ukraine. This funding is not sent directly to Ukraine. Rather, it pays for training and procurement of U.S. equipment. Congress has funded this initiative every single year since it was authorized in 2016 during both Democrat and Republican administrations. Just last month, the House voted to authorize this funding at the same level. Madam Chair, this assistance and the partnership between Ukraine and the California National Guard is what enabled the Ukrainians to beat back the Russian invasion and greatly diminish Russia's conventional military forces. I've been very clear to the Department, no blank checks. That was why this bill contains many new oversight provisions and funding for a Special Inspector General for Ukraine, if authorized in the final NDAA. The gentleman has often noted that funds used in support of Ukraine should go to securing our southern border. I argue that we should secure the border and partner with Ukraine to degrade Russia while never taking our eye off China. We do not yet know how the war will play out, but I do know that voting for this amendment would send the wrong message at the wrong time. I urge a no vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arkansas yields back. The gentleman from Florida has 1 minute remaining.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So the argument my colleague made is, well, we've always sent this $300 million. And that may be true, but we used to send that $300 million when we weren't sending $100 billion supplementals on top of that. So I don't think that argument really holds water. And then when my colleague says, well, we can do both. We can secure Ukraine's border and we can secure our border. My argument would be, can we at least secure our own border first? How about that? How about prioritize our own people first before we start engaging in misadventures throughout Europe? I reserve.
How much time? The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Madam Chair, may I inquire as to how much time I have left?
The gentlewoman has 3 minutes remaining.
Thank you. I want to thank the gentleman from Arkansas who struck the last word and also spoke on behalf of the chair of the full Appropriations Committee. I had the pleasure of being with Mr. Womack in Poland, where we did oversight of the very money that we're talking about right now. And what we watched was, and I've been in other theaters where we were supporting other troops, the enthusiasm, the commitment, the dedication that we saw from the Ukrainians who were under our supervision, getting ready to receive training, was outstanding. It was like nothing else I've ever seen before. And we do need to do our due diligence, and that's one of the reasons why I opposed an earlier amendment, which would have actually restricted the military from escorting us on those types of codels into the future. This is something that, in my years in Congress and working on many international foreign affairs issues, when I was in Germany just before at the conference, just before the Ukrainian invasion took place, I have never in my life seen the democracies so united to work together because they know of the threat of what's happening. And they want to make sure, and we want to make sure, that we continue to give the Ukrainians the support they deserve. I have a friend who's returning home from just visiting, and her cousin's going back after taking some R&R after being wounded. And, you know, the stories that she's sharing and the stories that I've heard from other people in Ukraine, you know, everybody is participating. 60-year-olds are driving the tanks because they can't be out there in the front line. And they're doing that, and they're able to do that because of the support and the equipment and the training that we've given them, not only to fight against Russia, but also to maintain the equipment they have. So I thank the gentleman for striking the last word and speaking to this. And we need to do our due diligence to make sure that the oversight is done right. But I do not support Mr. Gaetz's amendment as offered today. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman has the right to close. The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The United States of America is not the world's piggy bank, and we are not the world's policeman. I applaud all of the enthusiasm in Ukraine. I am rooting for them, but enthusiasm in this country is waning to continue to support all of that effort abroad. We want to secure our border. We want to see enthusiasm with our Border Patrol, and we do not support continued inflationary, escalatory, dangerous spending in this war in Ukraine. I thank the House's indulgence for considering my amendment. I would encourage its adoption, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized for 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman for this respectful debate, and I yield back any balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The questions.
Pursuant to House Resolution 723, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gaetz, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment reduces the amount of funding allocated to USAID by $4.5 billion. As I've mentioned earlier, USAID is a vehicle through which the American taxpayer pays for economic development in other countries. I think, instead, we should spend more money on the economic development of our own country, and actually, if we spent less money overall, we probably would see less inflation, more prosperity, and the type of economic growth that we saw during President Trump's time in office. USAID may have started with laudable goals, but today they're promoting abortion globally with American tax dollars. They are pushing President Biden's national gender strategy. I never thought we needed a national gender strategy, but if we need a national gender strategy, can we at least not spend so much money promoting it abroad? Silly. The DEI programs that are embedded in the 1619 project have been embraced by United Nations Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, and we see that continue to manifest through USAID. American taxpayers should focus their resources and their efforts on the American people and the American economy. This is a thoughtful reduction. It should be easily agreed to, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from I'm sorry. For what purpose does the gentlewoman seek recognition?
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Once again, I have no idea what my colleagues are trying to achieve. All this amendment would do is double down on the harm Russia's aggression has already wreaked on the poorest countries of the world through higher food, fertilizer, and fuel costs. This amendment would cut $750 million each from global health programs and the international disaster assistance accounts. These cuts would impose tremendous harm and suffering to the most vulnerable, including 4 million children with malaria will go untreated. 350,000 deaths attributable to tuberculosis. 13 million fewer children vaccinated, resulting in a possible 115,000 additional deaths. And a reduction of over 45% of humanitarian assistance to Sudan compared to FY 2023 levels. This doesn't sound much like pro-life to me, Mr. Chairman. It would also eliminate entire development assistance accounts, affecting agriculture and food security programs, education, and clean water for millions of the most vulnerable people in the world. Development assistance is also used for counter PRC influence programs, which represents one of our more effective tools to counter and compete with the PRC globally. It's really ridiculous, it's cruel, and it is not pro-life. These are not funds that would target to Ukraine in any significant way. It has no impact on the Ukraine debate and would inflict harm on millions of people. So I'd be happy to discuss with colleagues about how we support Ukraine's pursuit of freedom, but this amendment would only alienate the rest of the world and forsake many of our allies' reliant assistance on the United States. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman is recognized.
My amendment makes a $4.5 billion cut. $3.5 billion of that stops us from retiring global debt for Ukraine. Now, I don't think it's an unrealistic position to say that the United States of America should not deficit spend to retire the debt of other countries. Think about that. We are borrowing money from China to go settle the debts of Ukraine that they accrued far before this war with Russia. My colleague says that this exists to counter the PRC. We are never going to outbribe the PRC on the global scene. We are going to need another strategy. And if you listen to the debate of those opposing my amendment, hear the substance. Oh my goodness. People around the world are having problems buying food and buying fuel. And if the U.S. taxpayer will just sacrifice a little more, it might be easier to buy food and fuel in other countries. I have a message for my Democratic colleagues. People are having a hard time buying food and fuel in this country as a consequence of the very inflationary spending that I am trying to reduce with this amendment. We should retire our debt before we retire Ukraine's debt. That is such an obvious statement, I am shocked I have to say it on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, where I'm just glad we're still hanging our flag. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, let me just suggest this. It really is an unrealistic position for the United States to allow 4 million children with malaria to go untreated, to allow 350,000 deaths attributable to tuberculosis, to allow 13 million fewer children vaccinated, resulting in a possible 115,000 additional deaths, and a reduction of over 45% of humanitarian assistance to Sudan compared to 2023 levels. Very unrealistic, cruel, and unusual. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's hard to believe what I am hearing. The gentlelady is saying, but there's malaria and tuberculosis and sickness and ailment all around the world. The gentlelady need look no further than her home state of California, where the human condition continues to decline. She would need to look no further than the major cities throughout our country that are under Democrat control. So maybe before we go solve all the world's problems, maybe before we function as the world's policeman and the world's piggy bank and the world's debt payer, we ought to focus on the issues that we have here in this country, and they are real. And frankly, too often, they metastasize from the gentlelady's home state. I reserve.
Has the only time.
I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment.
This amendment ensures that none of the funds appropriated in this act will be used to administer the Paris Climate Accord. The Paris Climate Accord is the unilateral surrender of the American economy, not for the sake of any sort of environmental improvement. It merely uses the veneer of climate change to execute a permission structure for some of the dirtiest countries in the world, for some of the greatest polluters, to be able to benefit at the expense of the United States. The Paris Climate Accord represents a circumstance where we were dead money at the table, putting up cash in exchange for economic development in faraway lands that would not benefit our people. This was a globalist enterprise. It was America last, and U.S. taxpayers should not be funding the Paris Climate Accord. That's the amendment, and I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, it is very clear from the science that the most existential crisis the world faces is from the growing climate crisis. Without intervention, our warming planet will have irreversible negative impacts on the United States and throughout the world. Climate change has resulted in lives upended in Texas and Florida, has led to extreme flooding in California and Vermont and throughout the country. And climate is not an issue that can be addressed by countries on their own. Air, water, pollution, they do not respect boundaries or sovereignty. The Paris Agreement, in recognition of this, brought all countries together around joint goals achieved by individual country plans. As proposed, this amendment would significantly damage the efforts of the United States to support developing countries as they pursue efforts to implement their commitments under the Paris Agreement. In addition, a wide range of U.S. climate and development programs would be impacted by this amendment, and it would seriously impede our ability to implement our obligations under the Paris Agreement. It would also prohibit the Department of State from participating in critical international climate negotiations. The climate crisis poses threats to the stability of countries, heightens social and political tensions, and adversely affects food prices and availability. And this is according to our own military. The need for foreign assistance will only increase if we do not address this significant driver of crises around the world. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I'd yield such time as you may consume to Chairman Diaz-Balart.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I want to thank the gentleman from Florida because he raised some, I think, very important issues regarding the Paris Agreement. Look, even if it were true that global emissions will result in this global apocalypse in the distant future, the truth is that most developing countries are irrelevant in any climate model used to speculate about temperatures 100 years down the road. These countries have emissions that are nearly frankly undetectable when compared to the real culprits, which are China and other countries in Asia, which, by the way, are exempt, by the most part, from this climate accord. So while our bill already prohibits funds for the Green Climate Fund, the Clean Technology Fund, and other vehicles that could be used to carry out this Paris Agreement, I agree, and I thank the gentleman, that we should ensure that no parts of this wasteful spending, this really virtue signaling, is allowed to continue. So I thank the gentleman, and I strongly support his amendment. I yield back. Thank you, sir.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, many of our developing country allies have made it very clear that strengthening their ability to address climate change and the threat that it poses is an overriding national priority, and they are looking to the United States for support. I was in COP27 in Egypt a couple of years ago, and this is exactly the message that was sent. The FY24 House SFOPS bill willfully ignores the changing climate and its implications for so many other global challenges this bill is intended to address, including promoting food and water security, global health, the protection of tropical forests, and other vital natural resources, and social and political stability in strategically important regions. According to the World Bank, climate change could pull 132 million people back into extreme poverty by 2030 and could drive the internal migration of an additional 216 people by 2050. Every one of our districts have been challenged by severe drought, rainfall storms, and heat. We are continuing to spend more and more on humanitarian needs caused by these disasters, both domestically and abroad. We need to get ahead of these crises. Helping communities cope, especially those with the least means to do so, is both moral and smart. Why are we demonizing these programs and cutting ourselves off from valuable tools? These are not problems anyone can solve alone. We must work with others, which make cooperation and our multilateral tools work. That's what we need, such as the Clean Technology Fund, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environmental Facility. All of these and more are so important. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
It is neither moral nor smart to drive our nation deeper into debt, to jeopardize the future of this country so that we can engage in a globalist virtue signal. If this global agreement were real and benefiting our country, I think you'd find more people that were open-minded about a desire to ensure that we have an environment that is good for all of the inhabitants of the planet Earth. But unfortunately, that's not what the Paris Accord did. The Paris Accord required the United States to put up the cash, and then it gave the exemptions to China and India and the worst polluters on the planet Earth. So this isn't a question about whether or not we support the environment. This is a question about whether or not, under the veneer of environmentalism, we are going to kill American jobs, kill American manufacturing, make our country less competitive, drive down our GDP, while China and India play us like fools. We are better than that. The underlying bill does great work to ensure that our resources are directed to America's interests, not to these interests of these global institutions. I would encourage adoption of the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman Rios back. Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just one point I'd like to mention with regard to the climate emergency, which it is. You know, our young people deserve a future. They deserve a planet that is here for them. And I think we need to understand that the work we do in this House, or that we are not doing, really affects their future and their lives and their livelihoods. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The question is on